Welcome to today's conversation we're having titled, Everything You Believed About Relationships is Wrong. The counterintuitive truth. So, what do we mean by that? Well, let's start by talking about relationship problems and pains. And what are some of these pains that we experience in relationships, and what kind of relationships are we talking about?
Yeah. That's the first thing is we don't just mean marriages, because when people throw out the word relationship, everyone assumes, oh, you mean love relationships. But we mean every kind of relationship. Marriage, colleagueship, family, in-laws, children, your landlady or landlord. Every kind of relationship you can think of.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes. And we can see the same patterns show up across a variety of types of relationships in our lives. Like for myself, one people problem pain that I experience across relationships is disappointment. Whether that's disappointment with my spouse not doing something the way that I had hoped, or disappointment with an employee, or disappointment with a friend. We can see that's a theme that shows up in my life.
Everywhere. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship.
Yeah. What are some others that come up for you?
Well, so one we were talking about earlier, which is petty tyranny. So you can have, people show up in your life where they are petty tyrants, like they're tyrannizing you over little things. And this is a kind of situation, power dynamic or power differential you can get into with landlords and landladies, but also with colleagues. And if you live in a work situation that's pretty hierarchical, that's going to show up. The communication gatekeepers that annoy the hell out of you because they just have to be controlling about stuff. And also people who have maybe even an undiagnosed sort of generalized anxiety. They tend to be, they can be pretty controlling, and if they don't get their way, they can get quite upset. So there's a petty tyranny about emotions. If you're conflict avoidant, you're going to be fodder for someone who wishes to emotionally control the environment.
Yes.
Because you're going to be conflict avoidant, and so they've got you right where they want you.
And then to a lesser degree, you can just experience frustrations in your colleagueship or trying to work on a project with teammates or even friends that maybe have a illogical in your mind way of looking at things or dealing with things, or way of being that can just drive you crazy and really get in the way of getting anywhere with this project that you want to do.
Yeah, and teamwork is coming up for me. Teamwork is a big place where idiosyncratic ways of working and control issues and hysterical emotional bombing of stuff, and some people are more domineering and some are more quiet. All of these power differentials can show up in teamwork in myriad ways, and it's really difficult when your life and your money and your family's well-being depends upon these idiots that you have to work with. It's tough stuff.
It is tough stuff. And all across the world, people are in these challenging dynamics, and people are suffering, and they are experiencing their frustrations, however those come up for them.
And let's throw dating in there too, because I heard from a certain friend of mine when she was dating that I think I said to her one time, have fun. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
And the certain friend, which is actually Rachel sitting across from me, was like, fun? Dating is not fun, okay? You obviously haven't dated in a long time. It's some more tough stuff. Like, how do you deal in the dating world? you know?
It's true.
I can't
It's
speak
rough.
to that pain myself.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm not in that world anymore.
Welcome to Magenta FM, a show for people who aspire to deeper, richer, and more healthy ways of being in community, in leadership, and in relationship with others. I'm Louisa Barnum.
And I'm Rachel Hazlett-Carr. How do people, in your experience, respond to these myriad pains and problems that come out of relationships?
Yeah. So I have bad news and I have good news about this. And this is pointing to the counterintuitive truth that we mention coming into this episode. And that is that all the relationship issues that you're dealing with, I realize that you believe it's the other person's fault. And you're going to have a lot of evidence to support that point of view. And I'm not saying that you're wrong, because I believe you if you were to tell me their behavior was bad or manipulative or inappropriate or wrong or immature or infantile or whatever. You're not wrong. However, if you continue to believe it's the other person's fault that you're in this dynamic, you are giving away your power. From that vantage point, you actually cannot dig yourself out of that particular situation. So what we want to do is reframe this for you to be not about the other person at all. And the reason why is because we want to encourage you to take back your power by owning the problem instead of giving away your power by believing the problem is the other person. So
this is the counterintuitive truth.
Yes. Now, we do not mean you have to take the blame. We do not mean that you are at fault. We do not mean that you have to shoulder all of the responsibility of the dynamic, because it takes two to tango, right? However, so long as you have any part of you that really believes that the other person is at fault or is to blame, in other words, you are projecting onto the other person, you are not free. You are locked into what we call the checkmate. Now, we're going to talk about the checkmate in great detail down the line. So you can kind of flag that word because it's a really potent idea or concept. But let's just call it a checkmate for now, when you're in a situation where you believe the other person is at fault, because there's no way out of that scenario unless they take responsibility, they apologize, they own it, and then you're freed. But the thing is, people don't change just because you want them to. They change because they choose to.
And it's such a disempowered place to be when you're just the victim.
Yeah.
And you're just waiting in frustration and helplessness and disappointment.
Yes.
It's really a dead end road.
It's a dead end road. Yeah. There's no way out of that scenario. So how do you take your power back? How do you get out of it? Well, you own your part in the dynamic. Okay. So this is obvious. What's not obvious is this. I'm going to walk you through a thought exercise. So just picture to your mind, you're in a dynamic with someone. It could be your husband or wife, or it could be with someone who's a petty tyrant in your life. Just have that person in front of you and just recall in your mind, in your imagination, the last negative interaction you had with that person. And just remember what it felt like and the beliefs that you were holding about that person at the time. And now I'd like you to superimpose over that person that they are, imagine that they are the world. They are not them, they are the world, and the world is mirroring something back to you. So in other words, you get triggered, you have all this stuff come up, you're really maybe angry at that person, but what you're really angry at is the world. The world is simply mirroring something back to you about your own inner experience. So that's the picture.
So we don't mean a literal figurative mirror where the mirror is showing you exactly what it is in yourself that you're not seeing because, for instance, you may be in a dynamic and are often in a dynamic with someone who has a pattern and a way of being that's very different than you.
Yeah, like
that's
the
why
opposite.
They say opposite attracts.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
So the other person may be very passive, very, conflict avoidant. And I'm speaking from experience here. And that may trigger in myself a response of frustration and irritation and anger, like wanting that other person to come forward. And so it's not that the other is showing me my own conflict avoidance because that's clearly not what is
it's not your issue.
Yes,
no.
What's coming up for me. They're showing me the something inside of myself that needs
attending to.
Yes.
So it's not super. We don't want to make this too simple, but we do want to make it. I should say we want to make it simple, but it's not necessarily easy. Just to sort of lay it out for you in a very kind of general way, when you own the problem, your people problem, you are taking back your power. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. So for the last 15 years or so, I've been coaching. And I often have coached teams and management teams. And sometimes I have mediated when things have gotten really hair-raisingly bad. So I've done some of that, but also just helping these teams work on their team dynamics and issues. So when I coach for 2 hours. I don't coach for 1 hour. I'm like, we can't get deep enough into the issue. So it's like 2 solid hours of coaching. And during that time, when we're working on a particular dynamic with a particular other person, my client at the end of the session often reflects back to me when we do our checkout. They say, I noticed that we never actually talked about the other person, like hardly at all. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because it's not about the other person. Your trigger is actually not about the other person. And this is what's so counterintuitive about conflict and about disagreement and issues that we have with other people. In other words, our people problems. They're actually not about the other person when you really boil down to it. And if you want to overcome and heal from those particular issues, because if they're showing up in one relationship, chances are they're going to show up in all your relationships eventually, right? This particular trigger, this particular dynamic, it's going to show up in other places in your life, because how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Okay, well, right? I want to get to what is the real reason. Let's take a quick break and get right back to what is actually at the heart of the matter here.
Okay.
Would you like a serious solution to your people problems? One that is deep and lasting? Would you like to be able to raise the quality of interactions you have with the people in your life and work? Most people believe that the solution to ongoing people problems, such as conflict and misunderstanding, is memorizing the right thing to say or some other clever tactic. However, there are always situations where such tactics simply won't apply or succeed. Instead, you need something that can help you be present and generative in every interaction, every moment, no matter how unexpected or difficult or how high the stakes are. The truth is, you can shape the interactions you have merely through the quality of your presence. Unfortunately, an authentic and elevated quality of presence doesn't come easily or naturally any more than playing the violin does, because it's a trained and honed way of being. Like a master of Tai Chi, you can learn to work with the social spaces between you and others, not with manipulation, nor with dominance or force, but with a greater freedom, greater understanding and generosity, and a stronger presence of mind. Imagine having the kind of presence that commands respect, not because you're the alpha, but because others rise to meet you there. Imagine attracting in your life and work the kinds of high-functioning relationships that you long for. Magenta Academy for the Social Arts has developed a path to help you grow an elevated presence. Join the Elevated Presence Masterclass, where you will begin building a foundation for transforming your relationships. Enrollment opens soon, don't miss out. Go to magenta.fm/elevated presence to get on the waitlist.
Welcome back.
Awesome. So, what we finished with before the break was we were talking about the world as mirror, and that in my coaching, we rarely talk about the other person. And they're very surprised by this. And I have consistently got that feedback. And the reason is because while we will study the dynamic that's going on and what they're struggling with, but we'll analyze it only from their point of view. In other words, we'll study how it impacted them. And then we'll trace the nature of the pattern or the event. If it's shown up more than once, it's a pattern. And if it's only shown up the once, as far as they know, then we'll just trace it. We'll look at how it played out through time. And then we will observe, usually, that it's also showing up as a pattern that has a different expression, but harmonic to this particular event at other times, and maybe even with other people. So they'll start to see through this sort of dialogue between us, how this is actually an expression of something in them. And that something is what we, Rachel and I, call a wound. A wound with a capital W. Because, and this is our language that we've sort of developed over the years, because the nature of a trigger has an origin story. And if we really want to overcome the trigger, if we really want to be able to genuinely own our part in the dynamic, we're going to have to trace that trigger back to its origin story. And that's the wound. And the wound, we have this tool or method that we use that we call naming the wound. So you know the fairy tale. I'm sure you're familiar with the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, right? Mm-hmm. So in fairy tales, there is a tremendous wisdom. They're very, very old. They predate Christian times. They're like remnants of the ancient wisdom of the nature of the soul. And so they're very precise analogs for many soul dilemmas, which is really cool because I often have used them in coaching. And Rumpelstiltskin is a particularly important one because if you're not familiar with it, let me just quickly say it. So there's this funny little man who gives power to this miller's daughter. She can spin straw into gold thanks to him. So he basically saves her life, but he wants something from her in recompense. And she becomes queen. She marries the king. And Rumpelstiltskin comes back to her and says, all right, I want my payment. I want your firstborn child as my payment. And she gets extremely upset, so upset that Rumpelstiltskin has a little pity on her and says, all right, well, if you guess my name, then I won't take your child, but you will never guess my name. Well, she ends up by guessing his name. And she guesses not just close to his name, but his precise name. And he no longer has power over her, and he can no longer take her child. So this is an analog for what happens when we name our wound, when we really understand the nature of our wound, its origin story, how it plays out in us in 3 areas of our inner life. In our thinking, so how does a wound play out in what you believe about yourself or what you believe about the world?
How you perceive things.
How you perceive things.
What are the conclusions that you draw about
yes.
people? What are the assumptions that you make?
Yes. Expectations that you have.
Yes.
Yes. And then in your feeling life is the second area. What feelings come up in you when you are triggered? Like when that wound is expressing itself in you, what are the typical ways in which you experience your feeling life? Do you get angry, disappointed, frustrated, resentful, despair, hopelessness, all those things? And then the third realm it shows up is in what you do. So what are your behaviors? What are your coping mechanisms? What do you do? Do you withdraw? Do you get angry? Do you, what do you do when you get angry? Do you lash out? Do you shut down? Do you leave the room? How do you behave? So those are the three realms in which we can study how the wound shows up in us. And it's very important that we understand the nature, because, we respond to life, each of us, in very unique ways. We are unique people. However, there are archetypes that are at play in the way that wounds are, in their you could say their anatomy. And I have seen, I have observed, that's our dog clicking around. I have observed through coaching a lot of different people, that there are archetypes, there are typical things that you can observe in the dynamic of a wound as it plays out within you. Now just imagine you've got your wounds and then the other person has their wounds. And guess what happens when we trigger each other? Our wounds start dancing together.
Yes, that's the dark side of opposites attract.
Yes, in fact, I have a working theory that the reason why people are attracted to each other in love relationships actually has nothing to do with chemistry at all, but it has to do with our shadows recognizing each other and going, ooh, I recognize that shadow. Because we are drawn to our medicine. We are attracted to our medicine. And so, it's amazing to me to see how this plays out. And I'll just give you an example from my own life. So my husband's mother has the same birth date as my father. My husband's father has the same birth date as my mother. Isn't that so cool? So
you two have some, entangled family patterns and
very similar. Very similar. Yeah, we were raised in some similar environments, even though on the other side of the world. So me in New Zealand and him in Texas. Can you imagine a Texan and a New Zealander? But we met in Europe, right? And it wasn't until sometime later that we realized that our parents had these birth dates. That's just so weird. It's like a coincidence. However, it's also just a picture. It's a picture of how our shadows unconsciously recognize each other. And this is why it's really not about the other person when we get triggered.
Yeah. And you can see this, or one thing that's coming up for me is that we all face these different dilemmas and things not going exactly the way that we want them in life. But what really triggers me may not be the same thing that really triggers you. So while neither of us are going to live a life that doesn't have things going in ways we didn't expect or would prefer they didn't go, that doesn't mean that we have to get triggered. We have to react and get into a dynamic around it. So there's really a distinction there. And yeah, especially and then going back to your point about the shadows, or what you could call the dance of the shadows, the dark side of our opposite attraction. Yeah. This is so easy to see in a marriage because you live with the person and you go around and around the same things all the time, so you can get really familiar with them and really overcome them. It's really a great place for us to grow and learn about ourselves.
Actually, that's true. And that's a nice tail into this other thing that we need to talk about, which is what happens, the magic that happens when we own our stuff. So especially in a marriage, like both you and I have experienced this in our own marriages, where like I remember when I was, we were newly married. This is like 23 years ago, and we had a new baby, because that both happened exactly around about the same time. And we were in the thick of it because we both were pretty darn wounded. And we had a lot of stuff to work through, and we were perfect partners, but it was really tough because we did have a lot of, our wounds would just, they intersected with a kind of tapestry weaving. I don't know how to really say it. That was so like beautifully woven together. It was really tough to work through.
And that's one way to put it. So your beautifully woven together tapestry of wounding and challenge, which for someone else might be like, it was a beautiful reason for divorce.
Yes.
A beautiful, example of why I just shouldn't be with that person. And then they go and leave and go find another partner who's
pretty much the same.
Exactly the same tendencies.
Exactly. Yeah. So I remember one day, and Jeff, my husband, is better at this than I am. And he was then, and he still is better at this than I am, even after 23 years of working at it. Anyway, but he came and apologized to me for something, because we had an argument. I don't even remember. It was a long time ago. But he came and apologized to me and owned his partner. He said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have reacted to you that way. He didn't, he wasn't talking about how I reacted. He was just owning his own thing. And I remember this visceral feeling of like these chains falling away from me. Like I didn't even know that I was captured by them in the first place. But I had this experience of, oh my God, his owning this freed me. He freed himself of the pain of it and the anger and the resentment and the blame by apologizing and owning it. And then he didn't have that anymore. And it freed me too. It freed both of us. It only took one of us to own it for everyone else to be freed of the checkmate of that. That was such a powerful experience that I never forgot it. And I have subsequently experienced that over and over again in our relationship, because it was a real hallmark of, okay, this is what we have to do in order to get through this, right? And this, now, of course, as I have brought this into my coaching practice more and more, and realized more and more, because I've seen it play out consistently, the more we can own what happened without taking on, like a martyr, the other person's stuff, right? What they thought, what they felt, and what they did is their responsibility, because what you think and what you feel and what you do is yours. But if you can own that, it has tremendous magic and power in the world. Because not only do you free yourself from the chains of the tyranny of the shadow and your wound, it frees the other person too. Mm-hmm. Now imagine if you did that as a country. The leadership of a country was to step forward and say, okay, we were wrong. We own the pain and the trouble we caused. We're very sorry.
Despite whatever was happening on the other side of the court, on the other side
no blame,
of the border.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is powerful stuff. And this is, we're going to go more into, because this is an invisible terrain. This is the realm of the soul life. You cannot touch it, you cannot measure it, you cannot see it. It's completely invisible and immaterial. But nevertheless, I'm sure you'll agree, is very, very real. And the spaces between us, there's content there, there's stuff there. And we can learn to shape those spaces with love and understanding that takes on a kind of magical healing, far greater than the sum of its parts kind of capacity or energy or potential. Mm-hmm. And
it exists at all scales, which is what you're pointing to, which is really interesting and powerful, because once you learn how to work with this at one scale or many scales, you can see how it can be applied at the largest scale all the way up to community level or in the, the level of nations.
Yeah.
There's some examples that were coming up for me as you were talking. There's plenty that comes up around marriage because, like we said, that's such it's such an easy practice space.
Yeah.
Where you're so close with another person. But another one that was coming up for me was as a boss.
Oh, yeah. So Rachel has been a CEO.
Yeah.
She is the CEO of what we're doing too.
So yes, I've had experiences as a boss where, let's say disappointment came up, which is a theme for me that comes from a certain wound. But it's very easy to come up without, it comes up without immediately knowing that that's where it's coming from, typically, especially early on when we're just starting to work with these things.
Yeah.
And so you may have the experience of disappointment, or I had the experience of disappointment with an employee, for instance, or a group of employees, and take that to, I would come to them with all of these emotions and anger and frustration and anxiety and then try to do work there, which is really a miserable place to do work for everybody, especially the poor employees that, have less power in the situation than I did. But if I can recognize that I'm bringing my own wound or my own fear, a lot of times there would be fear involved, and still come to the dilemma that we're facing or the challenge that needs to be solved or the problem that needs to be, addressed or adjusted, I can come to it with a completely different gesture and a completely different approach that has such a superior outcome for everyone involved, for the project, for myself, and for the people who you're working with. So many things fail actually because of people problems.
Yeah. Also, another piece of good news, thank goodness, and that is that this realm of the soul of our inner life. We're just going to call it the soul because this is kind of like we're building a shared language here. So this realm of the soul is actually fractal in nature. So when you study it, when you do your inner work and you study it, and we're going to talk about the anatomy of the soul in the second episode, because this is how we can get to know its fractal nature and how we get to recognize the playing out of the wound, not only within yourself, but you can start to recognize the same wound playing out at all scales. So the archetype of a wound that plays out within an individual, you can, as you get to know it, like for instance, the impact, how we internalize traumatic experience. You can start to if you get to know it within yourself really intimately, you develop organs of perception. You develop the eyes to see when it's playing out at other scales. You can see it playing out in a community because you really understand it. And you can see it playing out across an entire nation. And there are plenty of people who will talk about, for instance, American culture as having a lot of unacknowledged trauma because things are so polarized and so black and white, which is a pretty typical response to internalized trauma. It's like PTSD. I read that in this wonderful book. Actually, it's sitting on the shelf behind me, Trauma Stewardship. I found that a really interesting point of view. So this is the really fascinating thing about doing inner work. It actually is a training ground. It's not just a nice to have to do your inner work and to heal and grow. It's not like, yes, it would be lovely if we could spend time. Actually, it's incredibly important, not just so that you can be a healthier human being and a nicer person to be around for other people, but actually because it informs you about the nature of being human, and it will deepen whatever work you're doing, because whatever work you're doing, whatever your career path, you're dealing with people. I don't care whether you're a biologist or a mathematician, you're always dealing with people, and you're working within systems that have been created by people. And if you understand human nature, you can start to have insights and perceptions into this invisible realm that you couldn't before because you didn't really understand. So the first place of practice is within yourself. It actually doesn't happen the other way around. Like you could study systems and, the collective
Theories.
human nature, and you will not gather the kind of insights that you will if you study yourself and your own inner world. You can learn a lot about archetypes, about anatomy, about the very nature of this inner realm. So the wound is a part of the picture.
Yes.
It's a part of what you need to understand. And when you're in relationships with other people, it's a perfect place to get to know the nature of wounds.
Right, firsthand.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about a few other types of examples.
Yeah.
So one example that's coming up for me that I want to be sure that we exclude from this conversation is the nature of violence or abuse.
Abuse, yeah. Yes. So let's characterize violence in a relationship as both emotional and physical. They are both violent. So when we say take responsibility for for the dynamic, we don't mean take responsibility for abusive behavior. That's on them. That's entirely their thing. We don't mean to imply or to say you are responsible for someone else's behavior. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is you're responsible for your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. In other words, how you're showing up and how you deal with whatever happens. It's kind of like when life happens, are you going to complain about it and get upset and be disempowered? Or are you going to take what's been given to you and work with it and take responsibility for it and say, all right, this is my truth and my reality, and now I'm going to take my power and I'm going to work with this. So when you're in a situation where there is abuse and there is a violation, of that nature, I think as painful as this can be, I think it can be really helpful to begin a process of inquiry of discovering why you were there in the first place. And again, there is no fault finding. There is nothing that is weak or insufficient about you if you find yourself in that situation. That's not what is trying to be shown to you by being in that situation. It's not about lack in you, right? What it really is about is the evidence of a possibility, of a potential. So for instance, if you have a family where there's been abuse in your past, and you may not even be aware of this until you start asking about it, but there's something that has been hardwired in you where you superconsciously, we're going to talk about superconsciousness next episode, or even you could call it a subconscious, from the unconscious shadow realm, where you seeked out that kind of relationship or that kind of experience. And again, I don't really want to include really abusive and violent and dangerous situations in there, because there's a level of complexity that I think, in my experience, is only really answered if you have a spiritual worldview. If you don't have a spiritual worldview, it is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to understand why this would happen to you. If you have a spiritual worldview, then there's a possibility for you to understand why this happened to you. So let me just sort of pause there. I just can't wait to see what kinds of comments we get on this episode. But let me just pause there. And if you're interested, let us know in the comments if you want to hear more about that, because we can certainly talk more about that. This is just something that has come up in my work with people who are struggling to understand, for instance, extreme bullying in school when they were little children. And that's one story that I could tell at some point. Anyway, but the way that we can work with what was given to you, as unfortunate and as painful and as traumatizing as it might have been if you have been on the receiving end of violence, is to ask, okay, so what can I take responsibility for in my healing journey? Why did this happen? There is something in me that is patterned or hardwired to be in this situation. And you can look, I think there's a word for this called epigenetics. And I think they mean by epigenetics more of a genetic and physical kind of
imprint or...
Yeah. But I like to use that word much more in line with psychology rather than actual genetics. It's a very useful word because we can talk about the epigenetics of psychology because we do inherit so much patterning from our families of origin. And so I am pretty confident that if you have experienced varying degrees of violence in your life, that there is going to be a family pattern. There's some hard wiring in there, and it could be very deep. It might be that this is a level of inquiry that your family has never actually engaged with, but you very well could find it in your grandparents or great-grandparents. There can also be a cultural inheritance there too, depending on, like in New Zealand, for instance, we have a very high rate of domestic abuse, some of the highest in the world. We also have a lot of alcohol abuse and drinking, and alcoholism is definitely in my family. But would you ever imagine that New Zealand, had a high level of domestic violence? No, I mean, we're such nice people. We're so nice. And we're very friendly.
Yeah.
But this is going on. And this is what I mean by epigenetics.
Right.
So there's a sort of a hard wiring that can be very deeply buried, but very, very worthwhile to seek out and understand. Because if you know that you have this, then you can do something about it. But if you don't know, then it's just a repetition until you finally decide enough is enough. It's going to stop with me. Yeah. And it's not going to be passed on to my kids.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes there's not an event. Sometimes there isn't one event that explains everything away, but we can look to the beliefs. We can get really familiar with the conclusions that we're drawing and the beliefs that we have about the world that are, shown to us when we're just reacting to a difficult situation. We can really get to the heart and see that there may be things there that we don't totally understand where they came from. But even seeing the belief and naming that as something that's not congruous with actually what we consciously believe or want to consciously believe, that alone can be transformative and allow us to choose something different.
Yeah, that's true. And I'll give you an example from my life. And that is, I only relatively recently uncovered the fact that I have believed my entire life that I didn't matter. And, but now that I sort of see it, I can see all this evidence, looking back through my biography of how all this behaviors and all these decisions and all this fear that I lived with was as a consequence of this belief. It's like how you do one thing is how you do everything. So if you believe that you don't matter, then that's going to impact every aspect of your life. But I didn't I didn't get all the way down to that level. So the way that I thought it was expressed in me was a lack of confidence, or that I wasn't good enough. Actually, that was a big piece of it. It's like I wasn't quite good enough. That was the explanation. Like it wasn't really in my destiny. It wasn't really my job to shine. It was, I wasn't ever going to be allowed to shine. And because I sort of lived with that semi-conscious belief, that would sometimes surface in a conversation with someone with some self-reflection, but, got buried and forgotten. And it wasn't until I realized that what underlay all of those beliefs was the mega belief of I didn't matter, that the world was ruled by indifferent gods that didn't see me or notice me or care about me. When I got down to there, only then did things really start to shift, that I could find courage again.
And where do you think
for the first time, probably.
Where do you think that came from?
That definitely that's definitely epigenetics. Like my dad's mother died when he was 3, and when he was 5, he was sent to boarding school. So from 5 years old, he had no parents around him. He was at boarding school. His dad was very emotionally shut down. So in a way, you could say his older sisters probably did more to raise him than anyone else. And his dad married again pretty soon after to a woman who loved her kids more than her stepkids, for sure. And I mean, my dad did an incredible job of being a really amazing human being. But I am pretty sure, and I've not actually had a conversation with him about this, and I should, but I do believe that this is a part of a kind of a family inheritance. And my grandfather, there's some stories around him wanting to be one thing but ending up being an accountant. Like he wanted to he had a photographic memory, and he just had this incredible gift, right? But he ended up becoming a boring accountant, and was very shut down. So it's like this. And then on my mother's side, there's whole other stories that I can tap into as well. And then of course there's my culture, New Zealand culture. We have something called the tall poppy syndrome, which might be familiar to Americans more. But in New Zealand, we call it the great clobbering machine. So clobbering is when you hit someone over the head, if you don't know that word. So in New Zealand, if you're not normal, in other words, if you shine too brightly or you're too good at something, you have to be taken down to the normal because you've gotten too big for your britches, and that's just not okay. And I actually don't know why we are like that. Maybe that's a British inheritance, because we are, my ancestors are all British colonists, like 7 generations. So maybe that's a British thing. I don't really know. So I think it's sort of, I got whammied from 2 directions.
Yeah.
And so when you study these things and really try to understand the origin story, don't just look at your family, but also look at your culture of origin and see. And in America's huge. So maybe there's a cultural origin story in the South that is different from the North, which is different from the West or the East. So these are some other things to consider.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the wounds, they're inside us, but they are not. We have to do the work to really see them and understand them. They are sealed in some ways, and we think they're they're sealed.
Yeah.
But they actually reveal themselves in our relationships, issues.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
These other challenges that come up in our lives that give us the opportunity to really dig in and see if we can get to the heart of that and transform it, out of which there is freedom, and energy and creativity and all kinds of fruits that come out of that transformation. But a lot of times, I should say, the place that we can do really great work is it's in ourselves, but it's from things that we learn in our relationships with others.
Especially when we get into a dynamic. We never can learn so much as when we're in a dynamic. So we should be grateful if we can.
Yes.
Be grateful for these really painful and difficult experiences, because that is grist, for the mill.
Yeah.
And if we choose, and we are totally free to choose or not, because that's what's been given to us as human beings, is freedom to choose whether we do this work or not. Mm-hmm. But I will say that a part of what keeps us locked into these dynamics is something that we call compulsion. So long as the wound is untransformed, then we are compulsed, if that's a word. We are in we will be in compulsion. It's like addiction. Mm-hmm. We can't actually get out of it unless we learn to get to know the nature of the wound, and we give it its true name. Remember I was talking about Rumpelstiltskin? The secret to that story of Rumpelstiltskin is the power in the name. When you give something its true name, not just any old name, not just, but its true name, the name, when you give your wound its true name, it no longer has power over you. You are no longer compulsed like you were. And that's what that fairy tale has to teach us.
And what's really wonderful also is that oftentimes when we have that experience and we name the name and we take our power back and own why this is actually such a big deal for us, why we are actually reacting so strongly, not only is there a melting away of the burden of it all, or a freeing opening of the chains, as you put it, it oftentimes releases the other person too from their own chains.
Yes.
So while you may, without them even needing to do anything, there's a freeing of both people, which I've experienced a lot in my marriage and in other relationships, and it's really liberating.
Yes, you get released from the tyranny of the shadow. And so this is the magic. This is the magic of this work. And now imagine, let's say you're in a dynamic with one other person, and you recognize your shadow, you name it, it doesn't have the same power over you. You own what happened, you release yourself from the compulsion and the tyranny of the shadow. The other person is also released. Now imagine if you did that in a community with 100 people, and the ownership of the wound in you freed 100 people from the tyranny of the shadow. Now imagine if you were the leadership of a nation and you did that. You actually, I know in New Zealand, one thing the New Zealand government has done is apologized to the Maori people. They are the native people in New Zealand. Not only that, but recently the Maori language was, so New Zealand now has 2 official languages, English and Maori. And this is a part of so in other words, the language of the Maori people is being enlivened and being prioritized to such a degree that now every school child has to learn it in school. And even my dad, who's in his 80s, he is now learning Maori. He said it's the hardest thing he's ever done because he's trying to, remember the words.
Oh, good for him.
Isn't it cool? Yeah. So New Zealand has apologized to the Maori people for colonization and the brutality. See, the thing is, the Maori fought back. They were very skilled warriors. And we have a very mountainous terrain. So the combination of their skill as warriors and the mountainous terrain enabled them to not be completely decimated. So they were able to hold their own to a certain degree. So that plus... and I think that also kind of forced the New Zealand government into an apology, because they couldn't be denied, But that has enabled a lot of other things. And it's not like New Zealand doesn't have racism and an awful lot of problems. But imagine what would happen if the leadership of America apologized officially over and over again in lots of different ways to the Native Americans for the genocide that happened. What could shift? What could change? The ownership of the wound of America has not yet happened, either because of slavery or because of the genocide of the Native Americans, which is probably one of the greatest genocides, the biggest genocides in history, so far as I understand. These things have not been acknowledged or owned. So this is what we mean by fractal.
Yeah.
This stuff is magic. It's so powerful, and it's counterintuitive. It's not about the other person who you believe is at fault for saying sorry. It's about you yourself showing up and owning your part, how you think, what you believe, what you conclude, what you feel, and what you do.
Yeah. So to be able to do that, we need to have a real understanding of the inner life of the soul. And we are going to get to that next week, which I'm excited to dive into the anatomy of the inner life. I just want to do a little recap of what we've covered today. And then we will see each other again next week.
Yeah.
So today we started with the people problems that we all face. And we listed a few of the relationship challenges and the variety of relationships that challenges show up in. And then talked about the conclusions or the belief that we tend to have around that, which is that the other is at fault and what a stuck place that leaves us. And then the counterintuitive truth that we really dove into today is that you have the power, that we have the power within ourselves to free ourselves from the dynamic. And it's not about changing the other person. And in this act, we melt away the burdens of this dysfunctional dynamic and all of the headaches and heartaches and problems that it causes in our lives. And oftentimes actually frees the other person or frees an even larger group of people as well. And we call that taking back your power. And it really is the feeling of taking back your power. And it is just, I can just imagine so many moments of, oh, okay, I see what I'm doing. And, I'm sorry, babe.
It's really hard.
Actually what's going on. And it's really hard. And then once you do it, it's like, oh, okay, I'm free.
Yes.
We can move on now. We're done here.
Yeah, that's right.
And the heart of that, to be able to get to that, to be able to really have that experience in a way that's not, martyrdom or people pleasing. It's not a gesture of, I must be doing something wrong here, or I probably caused this, and just I'm sorry for existing, or whatever.
Exactly.
People
just run me over with a bus, okay?
Yeah, exactly. That's its whole own that's its own trigger response. But it's knowing and being able to name the wound. And I want to just add that I don't think it's been touched on today, that this work not only requires an understanding, as you mentioned earlier, of these concepts and of the anatomy of the soul, which we're going to go into next week, but it really requires practice and strength training and
strength
exercises.
Training.
And you really have to do work. It's not, you can't just read a book and
download the concepts.
Download this information. I'm sorry to say you won't be able to just listen to this podcast and then, go into the world and be
completely transformed. Yeah, we would love it if that could happen.
But it does take a bit more work than that. So that's the work that we get into in the school, are those practices and habit forming and really, getting deep into, the work that's needed. So next week, though, we will dive into the anatomy of the soul life, which is a really important piece for this work and this understanding. Is there anything else you want to add today before we sign off?
I think I really encourage you to write comments. Like, give us your questions. Tell us what is coming up from you when you listen to this episode. What are your questions? What are your issues? What was missing for you? What was confusing for you? Like, share it. We will read every single comment, and we will either respond to you in the comment right there, or we're going to create an episode just for you, all about that topic. So it's really important that you communicate with us, so that we know where you're at, what you're hearing, what you're understanding, what you're not understanding. Like, tell us.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
And I will see you next week.
See you next time. Yes.
All right.